I'm in the non-coveted position here of being the last person to present in a panel. And maybe I'll invoke my sort of status as a yoga teacher to encourage you to take whatever self-care you need to kind of manage the stress and emotions, etc. Here, one technique I find really useful is just taking a kind of deep and complete breath all the way in and all the way out. So I'll welcome you to sort of do that if it's of interest to you. I'm really excited to present this material, in part because so much of what has already been said in this session aligns with things I'm going to be talking about here in interesting ways. I'm a little, how should I put it? I've been really impressed how everyone else has sort of kept on time like clockwork, so I'm going to do my best to do that as well, so we have as much time for discussion as possible. So let me start by, again, sort of touching base on the fact that we're living through some pretty difficult times. I think many of those who would have thought issues regarding racism, white supremacy were a thing of the past have probably met with quite a rude awakening. We've all suffered through this pandemic where hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost needlessly. We've watched, perhaps, appropriate for us to discuss here, our technologies in certain ways fuel the conflagration. And behind the scenes, of course, we're seeing huge technological developments that are perhaps not making it to the front page of the newspaper or to the front lines of cable TV news, as well as things like this second wave psychedelic movement, which is really has the potential to revolutionize medicine. So that being said, we're here to talk about this technology, right, and how it plays into all of these different things. And it's interesting how over the course of this project, I've sort of found Marshall McLuhan's work to be a kind of touchstone. And there's a quote that's actually attributed to him, but was actually written in a piece about him by a friend of his, John Culkin, S.J., saying, "We become what we behold, we shape our tools, and then they shape us." And which is, again, I think, a theme which has appeared many times over the course of the conference so far. Well, when I first came into this project, I sort of used this term technologies of the self in somewhat of a tongue-in-cheek manner. Of course, those who are familiar with it in a broader sense know that this is an expression made famous by Paul Ricoeur in a seminar that occurred late in his life on the topic of the technologies of the self. And so I felt like I needed to do a little bit of homework and go back and kind of familiarize myself a bit more with what he actually was talking about there. And a couple of the major points, I think, to emphasize are that he saw technologies of the self as being one among four major types of technologies behind the so-called truth games of economics, biology, psychiatry, medicine, and penology. And these include technologies of production, technologies of sign systems, technologies of power, and then lastly, technologies of the self. And so in a sort of formative essay, which again was drawn from this conference, he says, technologies of the self permit individuals to effect by their own means or with the help of others a certain number of operations on their own bodies and souls, their thoughts, conducts, and way of being, so as to transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality. And of course, if you know Foucault, he's not just sort of simply putting this out there as a sort of statement about people's aspirations, but also more deeply tied into his genealogical project, connecting these sorts of technologies of self to things like power and oppression. So where does this intersect with my work? Well, first of all, it intersects with looking at the disciplines of yoga as a kind of technology or a set of technologies of the self. And in my recently published book, I argued that yoga in its history, from its ancient roots to its more modern manifestations, can be first and foremost understood as a form of mind-body discipline, and from there taking on secondary meanings such as a goal of union, which is a very popular way of interpreting or translating yoga, or a particular methodology such as the medieval Hatha yoga system or the modern Iyengar yoga system. And so what I'm arguing here is that it exemplifies in certain respects this notion of a technology of the self, or technologies found in practices like yoga posture or asana, breath control, pranayama, and dhyana or meditation, but very importantly aimed at both worldly power and otherworldly liberation. So for example, as I think I've cited before, in a well-known passage, Yoga Sutra 4.1, it says there are 5 sources of achieving extraordinary power through the practice of yoga. One is to be born with certain capacities, the fruit of former lives, herbs or oshadi, incantations or mantra, practicing austerities or ascetic discipline, tapas, and contemplation. And part of my research discovered that this list is in fact shared intimately in Buddhist Abhidharma philosophy. It appears in the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya in almost an identical formulation. And it's hard to imagine that these authors of the Hindu yoga tradition and Buddhist tradition weren't in conversation with one another. They're sharing a kind of common framework of ideas. And so those powers obtained through various sources are in addition or complementary to or at odds with the goal of liberation or moksha, which is, I think, often cited as the principal, if not the only, goal of yogic practice. So if we look, though, at yoga as a set of mind-body disciplines, we find a thread that ties together, a range of, let's say, indigenous Indian practices of asceticism and meditation and so forth, to the more modern postural and gymnastic forms of yoga, its adaptation into a kind of cosmopolitan, very Euro-American influenced representation of yoga, its connection to Indian nationalism. Here we have Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, practicing yoga with the community in New Delhi on the International Day of Yoga, down to all of these hybridized modern forms of yoga, which seem very distant perhaps from its ancient Indian roots, but nonetheless play on the idea that through mind-body discipline of some sort, one can achieve a state of power or perfection in the world, or even a kind of spiritual freedom or liberation. And one could say there's a certain liberation in laughter yoga, and there's a certain kind of liberation found in nude yoga as well. Well, what about biohackers? Well, biohackers, on the other hand, which are referred to in some cases as grinders, body modders, or body hackers, which are who are focused on a so-called do-it-yourself DIY approach to science, utilize a variety of methods, techniques, and materials, from cybernetic implants, use of nootropics or so-called smart drugs and psychedelics, do-it-yourself gene editing, fasting, various forms of bio-tracking or feedback, brain stimulation, but also, very importantly, drawing on traditions of yoga and meditation, often stacked. And I think that concept of stacking is a really interesting one to bring into this conversation, looking at yogis and biohackers, in part because this is a term used principally with respect to nootropics, the idea that I'm going to take a range of supplements, each of which has a particular function. So I might take, vitamins, I may take fish oil, but I may supplement that with certain things like phosphatidylserine, which is a sort of brain enhancer, or add to it other, things like mushroom extracts, etc., all in the interest of sort of building this stack of supplements which can enhance health and boost productivity or give a sense of power and control. But we might also talk about stacking of methods. So most biohackers don't just simply put cybernetic implants under their skin or attached to their bodies, but they're experimenting with nootropics and psychedelics. They're experimenting with gene editing, with fasting, using multiple methods to achieve their goal. And again, this in some respects parallels in profound ways in yoga, the way that different methods are utilized together in a kind of stacking process in order to enhance and to expand the force of one's yogic practice. You know, many yoga systems are actually framed as limbed system, the most famous of which is the Ashtanga or 8-limb system. One might think of that as a kind of yogic stack. Well, biohackers are often early adopters of technology, and viewed as techno-optimists. In other words, thinking that we should be doing this, in fact, as fast and as quickly as possible in order to address the kind of problems we see around ourselves, as well as techno-progressives that see this sort of transformation of oneself as being a gateway to transforming the world in progressive ways. Biohackers are a central part of the grassroots of the larger transhumanist or posthumanist movement. But at the same time, you find representatives even among high-profile tech gurus. And last but not least, biohackers parallel, and in some case, one could say are connected to the more industrial and scientific projects of human engineering and human augmentation that are happening at the larger scale. And so I took just a sort of a snapshot of some different biohackers here with various cybernetic implants. On the bottom left is a little sort of wink to Sigal Samuel, who wrote a really nice piece on the dynamics of biohacking for Vox a while back. In the center here, we have some materials drawn from the Humanity Plus, the Transhumanist Association website that really encapsulates a number of the key principles of transhumanism more generally, but of biohacking in particular, which include things like the concept of morphological freedom, the freedom to transform one's body and mind as one wills. Second here, the proactionary principle, the idea that these problems, such as the problem of future AI or singularity or autonomous weapons, those problems that are emerging from technology, according to some transhumanists, are not solvable with the sort of wetware biology that we currently possess. And so if we want to be in a position to really solve the problems that we see mounting in our civilization, the only way to accomplish it is to really transforming humanity, if not more perhaps profoundly and explicitly evolving humanity into something else. And so one of the ways actually transhumanism is framed is as a transitional human state between current humanity and post-humanity. And again, the idea being that the wetware technology we have as biological beings developed in the savannah to survive a particular type of human experience, and that we have not biologically evolved beyond that to suit our technologically advanced civilization. So biohackers see themselves as the tip of the spear in transforming humanity into a form that will be able to deal with the emergent problems that face our civilization. Well, how does this ultimately play out, though, in terms of going beyond the individual into the construction of the community? Well, first of all, whether one's talking about yoga or talking about biohacking, these practices help constitute what it means to be an individual. In fact, I argue in one of the pieces I just recently published is that the Indian yogis were perhaps some of the original biohackers. who pursued a special form of transformed mind, a nirmana chitta, via different forms of practices. In other words, these ascetic yogic stacks of things like using herbs, using ascetic discipline, using meditation, or things like bodily control or immobility, were ways of really transforming oneself that bear very deep analogies to what contemporary biohackers seem to be doing. Likewise, the biohackers themselves seem to be searching for a sense of identity that paradoxically is brought about by a quest for morphological freedom. In other words, the ability to change oneself from one's current state, perhaps into something more ideal, becomes a way of transforming oneself into that ideal, becoming what one truly envisions one is. One can argue, if we go back to the Foucaultian notion, that both seek to care and know the self. And these are the dual foci of many so-called technologies of the self that Foucault investigates. And he's particularly, in fact, interested in that essay in looking at both Roman and early Christian conceptions of self-identity that are constructed through various technologies, including, and very importantly, the practice of writing, which in some respects echoes a kind of mindful practice of self-understanding, and or in association with that, confession. And I think those two things are interesting in so many different ways, because again, it goes to some of the points that Natasha was making about, though we may not be inclined to think of writing as a kind of technology in light of what, the way we tend to think of technologies in cybernetic forms. But here you could say that the idea of mindfulness on one level, but also of tracking and reporting, all sort of play important roles in this kind of conception of how selfhood takes place. And it's not a large stretch to think about the way that people use biometric devices, which then they report through social media and becomes the basis for certain conversations, if not confessions. And likewise with other forms of social media, how we construct ourselves in part through creating a record of who we are through these digital media, and on some level confess and report that information to others. It's, I think, quite intriguing. Last but not least on this front, both can be, I would argue, interpreted philosophically and ethically within the framework of therapy versus enhancement. Both of them seem to reduce harm, reduce ills, and reduce suffering. And then on a certain level, go beyond that into the idea of enhancing human capacities, whether that be thought of in terms of perception or various forms of agency. Now, within the context of contemporary debates on therapy versus enhancement, as I think many of you are aware, therapy seems to be the lower hurdle to clear in terms of the moral or ethical value of a particular practice. We all agree on a certain level about removing suffering. In fact, in one of my classes, we were talking about how there are a number of key figures in the hospice movement who are now appealing for a kind of right to try of psychedelic drugs for people who are experiencing end-of-life anxiety. And one might say there's a very profound moral argument to say that if this is potentially something which is going to ease people's pain and suffering at the end of their life, why don't we let them do that? But it's a very different thing to talk about the other end of the spectrum, where someone perhaps wants to experience personal growth. In fact, there's a great Goop episode that's worth watching in which Goop employees go to Jamaica to take psychedelic mushrooms. One might say the moral and philosophical calculus there is a bit different than the person who's in hospice care. Of course, there are some transhumanists who say that the distinction between therapy and enhancement ultimately is an arbitrary one, It hinges upon things like ideas about normalcy that when you scrutinize them more closely are much less firm and solid than you might think otherwise. Well, last but not least, not only do yogic practices and practice of biohacking construct identity and selfhood in particular ways, but arguably they also construct community. Foucault and Bourdieu, for example, talk extensively about what might be called the genealogy of embodiment, the way that self-discipline inscribes or reinscribes social realities. And I mentioned reinscribe in part and refer to McCormick here because she argues that whereas Donna Haraway argues that the cyborg, for example, the person who's enhanced themselves and experiences morphological freedom, perhaps opens the door to breaking through gender binaries and other limiting conceptions of human embodiment. But McCormick, on the other hand, worries that as much as there might be that possibility, there's also the possibility that these technologies end up in subtle ways reinscribing the very sort of patriarchal and divisive ways of thinking about social identity that exist in the world today. Below, I mentioned this concept of hypermodernism, that it's perhaps not escaping these sort of modern and in many respects sort of patriarchal and in some cases racist ways of understanding embodiment, but reinscribes it perhaps in subtle, less apparent ways. Well, likewise, we might say that just as one inscribes the community on oneself through common practices, the body of the yoga or tech guru, for that matter, serves as the symbolic body of the community, linking both individual and communal identity. One of the things that really came out of this project for me was the notion that not only were these technologies important, but these personalities, these guru-like figures within the tech community who are sort of embodying the sort of values and virtues of the community were extremely important. Likewise, we might talk about the shared purpose, the discipline, and the presence to one another that bonds a community, whether it's of yoga practitioners together or of tech or biohacking practitioners together. Whether that goal is worldly power, spiritual freedom, or some sort of trans or post-human morphological freedom. And again, I don't want to go too deeply into it, but we can talk about issues about the way that technology, these sort of technological ideas like transhumanism embody both soteriology, like what is ultimately my destiny as an individual, but also sort of eschatology, like where are we going together as a community? Is there the possibility of individual immortality or some sort of utopian perfect society possible through our collective effort? And I think part of the enthusiasm in the biohacking community is less about the technology and more about being part of this movement towards individual and collective liberation. Of course, both have a shadow side. You know, in any sort of guru disciple context, you find abuses of power, you know, practices of spiritual bypass where personal concerns override concern for the greater good, or one avoids the negative aspects of oneself by focusing on particular practices. There's spiritual materialism, where the cultural capital of spiritual practice becomes a powerful mode of obtaining status. You know, and one last sort of story on this front, Steve Jobs famously is said to have read Autobiography of a Yogi once a year for his entire life. And at his memorial service, everyone went home with a gift box which contained a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi within it. And so here we have the tech guru and spiritual guru sort of coming together in a profound way. Well, in conclusion, there are a few lessons I think to be taken out of the Indic context for understanding technology and presence. The first being that power is not liberation. The latter can benefit from the former, but ethics is needed to balance the equation and in the sociodynamics of both yoga and tech communities. A point I argue in a recent paper is that ascension is not necessarily transcendence. A change of mode is not necessarily a change of kind. And so here we have the Buddhist wheel of life, where one might ascend to the heavens, achieve extraordinary powers, but ultimately, like every other state of existence, it's a temporary abiding, however long it should be. In fact, Anders Sandberg, a very famous transhumanist, argues that ultimately entropy always wins. And it sort of perhaps connects us here to the notion that even if you upload your mind to a computer, at some point that computer is going to fail. Last but not least, for the unenlightened or unwise, extraordinary capacities can be an obstacle. But for the enlightened or wise, it can be a tool for serving others with compassion, love, focused, and intentional presence. And again, in guru-disciple relationships, there's nothing more profoundly powerful than to have that attention of the guru, which again is a thing that can go both ways, right? It can open the door to very powerful and transformative relationships, but it can also open the door to abuses of power and people overstepping their boundaries. All right, that's it. Thank you so much.